Hello, my name is Dugan Petty. I'm an Education and Outreach Coordinator for NASPO Value Point. On behalf of our partners, Cloud BC and the Cloud Security Alliance, welcome to today's webinar, Cloud Solutions, Getting the Security and Controls Right. Thanks for joining us. I'll be your host for today's webinar. We have great speakers lined up, and we really got some pretty timely topics to talk about in the next 60 minutes. So we hope you get a lot out of today's webinar. NASPO Value Point is a nonprofit subsidiary of the National Association of State Procurement Officials. NASPO is dedicated to providing state chief procurement officers and the support and procurement resources that they need to get their jobs done. It was founded in 1949. WSCA-NASPO is the successor to NASPO Value Point. It's been facilitating cooperative purchases using a lead state cooperative purchasing model to meet state, local governments, school districts, public schools needs since 1993. And Cloud BC was just formed in 2015 as a British Columbia consortium to facilitate the procurement and adoption of cloud services by provincial public entities. So we welcome you to today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to go over a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the NASPO Value Point website. Also, contact Cloud BC and they can make available a recording as well. We'll also email the slides, including some additional reference slides and material that we won't go over today, but we have at the end of the slide presentation, to all the email registrants for your future reference. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so you can participate in the question and answers by asking questions at any time during the presentations. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box on the presentation panel. Please send your questions and use this box, and we can discuss them as we get into the question and answer session after the last presentation. If you're experiencing any media player issues or you have any other problems, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking the help button at the bottom of the console. Joining us today to discuss cloud services, procurements, and getting security controls right are Sophia Tam, Chris Hughes, Elaine Starkey, Gary Perkins, and Luciano J.R. Santos. They'll discuss three key topics today. They'll give you an overview of these new cooperative procurements for cloud services. They'll talk about assessing your data and workload security needs and identifying the standards and controls for cloud applications. And they'll talk about using the Cloud Security Assessment, the Cloud Security Alliance tools to assure that potential cloud applications meet your needs and your security needs for the applications you need in your jurisdiction. After the last presentation, they'll team up for a question and answer session. So send those questions in as you think of them as we move through the webinar. Before moving into today's presentation, I want to provide a little context about where we're at today and what really brings us to this webinar. The Cloud BC and the Utah-led NASPO Value Point procurements are two separate cooperative procurements for cloud services. While they're on a parallel track, they are being procured under different laws and rules and are intended for separate jurisdictions, namely British Columbia and the United States. These two teams from Cloud BC and NASPO Value Point have been collaborating since January 2015. We've been sharing ideas and experiences in an attempt to strengthen these cooperative purchases to serve the constituents in both jurisdictions. While the initial procurement scopes are different, they really overlap on infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. NASPO Value Point, the Utah-led procurement, is actually awarding on software as a service, platform as a service, and security services in the four NIST-defined deployment models of public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, and community cloud. And Cloud BC is looking at and awarding procurement for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. The procurement approaches differ, and you'll learn from the speaker how they are different, but one thing's clear, and that they must meet, the awards that come out of here must meet the needs of the purchasing agency. So to achieve that, the Cloud BC and the Utah State-led procurement are using Cloud Security Alliance tools to help the purchasing agencies to perform the due diligence that you need to perform to assure yourself that this cloud services application that you're selecting from one of these procurements really has the data and the security controls that you need. So now let me pass on the presentations. Let's get right to it and pass on the presentations to Chris Hughes and Sophia Tham. Just a word of introduction to Sophia. She's the procurement lead for Cloud BC. She's an information technology professional with over 25 years of experience in both public and private sector, including 10 years of senior leadership roles. She's been with Cloud BC for about 18 months and working diligently on an innovative and collaborative procurement to establish agreements in both infrastructure as a service and platform as a service for broader use by public sector organizations within British Columbia. Chris Hughes is the Assistant Director for Operations and Contract Legal Review for the State of Utah Division of Purchasing. He's the lead on the Utah-led Cloud Solutions multi-state procurement. As a member of the Utah and California bars, he's practiced law in both states until coming to work for the State of Utah in 2014. He started as a contract analyst, helping to negotiate terms and conditions, and was rapidly promoted to his current position. Christopher is a graduate of the University of Utah and the Quincy College of Law. So it's my pleasure to introduce these two contracting officers to talk about what's going on in these two jurisdictions. Sophia and Chris.
Thank you, Dugan. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia, and I'm here just to give a brief overview of the solicitation process that was run or is currently being run by Cloud BC on behalf of the Council of CIOs. So the solicitation process, we're referring to it as an invitation to submit offers, and shortened form of we're calling it the ITSO. And one of the key differences with this solicitation compared to what was done historically for the BC public sector is that in lieu of aggregating demand and selecting a single vendor, which was a typical practice, the key objectives of this solicitation is to actually create a marketplace to establish contracts with multiple vendors to support flexibility, choice, and competition. And in doing this, we will also allow or ensure that best practice T's and C's are incorporated into every contract that a public sector will use in terms of procuring cloud services. Because the marketplace is set up to basically pre-qualify vendors, there's a set of minimum requirements in order for a cloud provider to join the marketplace. And so these minimum requirements for entry include, one, that they must provide professional services as well as IS and or PaaS. And the reason for this criteria is just to manage the number of vendors that are in the marketplace. The second criteria is to filter out non-cloud providers. There are many hosted service providers that claim to be cloud providers, so we wanted to make sure that the vendors we put in the marketplace, we've confirmed that they are true cloud providers. And we're using the NIST characteristics to do so. The third criteria that we're using is that the vendor must meet minimum security requirements. And in this solicitation, we've done something new that we haven't done previously. We actually have requested specific cloud-focused security frameworks. We've asked vendors to comply with the newer frameworks. And so these are CSA STAR, which you'll hear about more later, the new ISO IEC 27017, and the NIST SP 800-53, which is the basis for FedRAMP. Even though we're talking about all three cloud-focused security frameworks, certainly our preference is the CSA STAR because Cloud BC has done worked with the government of British Columbia on developing lots of educational materials specifically related to CSA STAR. And finally, because of the very strict privacy legislation requirements in British Columbia, for those vendors interested in providing what we're terming data sovereign services, they must also meet a specific privacy and data residency requirements. As a final step in the solicitation process, we are going to be assessing some corporate profile type criteria, and this will allow us, if necessary, to do a ranking and limit the number of providers in the marketplace if required. We received feedback from the customers that if we had too many vendors, that the marketplace would be less valuable to them. So we want to have enough vendors to have competition, but not so many that it would become a cumbersome process to run a second stage procurement. Once the solicitation is complete, there will be multiple vendors in the marketplace that have signed what we're calling a Cloud BC framework agreement. And so the framework agreement has master or common T's and C's that all of the entities have agreed were important to them, and also allows for variations depending on each entity's business requirements. Eligible customers, which are the entities on the council, as well as the other BC broader public sector entities, they will make purchases based on their own internal procurement policies and guidelines. The key, though, is the intent is that for commodity-like services, there should be sufficient information available on the online marketplace website to support the selection decision. So we expect that for commodity services, just a PO needs to be issued. For complex purchases, a secondary selection process will most likely need to be run, but even if there's a second stage process required, this should be far more streamlined for the customer than if we didn't have the Cloud BC marketplace. So that, at a high level, is just an overview of the solicitation being run currently by Cloud BC. And now I'll pass it over to Chris to talk about UTAS procurement.
Yes, thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Dugan, for allowing me to go over the solicitation CH16012 for the cloud solutions that was issued as a cooperative contract for NASPO Value Point. The purpose of that contract was to execute master agreements with multiple qualified vendors to provide the participating entities of NASPO Value Point with software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service cloud services. The key objectives that we looked at when trying to put this solicitation together was to allow participating entities flexibility to make a best value determination in selecting which qualified vendor to sign a participating addendum with and which qualified vendor to make a cloud service purchase from. We took a very similar approach from Cloud BC in that we set it as a multiple stage request for proposals. We asked vendors to submit mandatory minimum requirements and to meet minimum score thresholds for the technical evaluation of the technical criteria identified in the solicitation. The mandatory minimum requirements were objective criteria that vendors needed to respond to by providing a point-by-point response in order to move on to the technical evaluation of the proposal. If a vendor did not meet or satisfy one of these objective criteria, they were rejected from their proposal was rejected and they did not move forward to the evaluation of the technical criteria. The technical evaluation was subjective criteria in which offerors provided a response to the technical criteria identified in the solicitation. On these criteria, the offerors could identify if a criteria was applicable or not applicable to their specific cloud service. These technical criteria included outlining the business profile of the offeror, including the organization and staffing of the offeror, the offeror's ability to work with a participating entity, including providing their marketing plan on how to market their cloud services to the participating entities. It included them demonstrating their compliance with the NIST standards and included their capacity to maintain and secure data, including a review of the CSA STAR documents submitted and data controls and security. In evaluating these proposals, we will ultimately enter into multiple master agreements with the qualified vendors. The master agreements will contain the terms and conditions, which contain the traditional NASPO value point master set of terms and conditions, along with specific terms and conditions to a vendor's offering. Each offering for the software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service has a specific set of terms and conditions that were put together with the help of the Center for Digital Government and with help of the vendor community when we put out a request for information. In addition, the master agreements will contain the scope of services that a vendor is authorized to provide to the participating entities. NASPO Value Point does not allow for scope creep within master agreements, so if a vendor is only allowed to offer platform as a service, they cannot try to sell infrastructure or software as a service to participating entities under the master agreement. The master agreements will also include the pricing catalog and applicable minimum discounts that is offered by an awarded vendor, and it will also include a copy by reference to the vendor's response to the solicitation, including the submitted CSA documents that the offerors were required to submit. Much like Cloud BC, participating entities will sign participating addendums and make purchases based on their own internal procurement policies and guidelines, including formal and informal processes to make a best value determination on which awarded vendor that they will make a purchase from. Purchasing entities may modify the terms and conditions made in the master agreement through their participating addendum, but they are not required to do so. They may rely on just the terms and conditions contained in the master agreement. So in working with Cloud BC, NASPO Value Point immediately noticed that there was a common approach and a similar outcome by both solicitations. Even despite the jurisdictional differences, there were many common elements, including a focus on choice and competitions. Both Cloud BC and NASPO Value Point wanted agreements with multiple providers to allow for flexibility and choice for their participating entities and eligible customers. In addition, there were minimum requirements established with the expectation that the participating entity and eligible customers will assess the awarded vendors and may assess them on even additional or modified requirements based on a participating entity or eligible user's specific needs. In addition, the contract frameworks were designed to support flexibility for participating entities and eligible users by allowing them to use those CSA documents to make decisions not just based on what a vendor's solution or service looks like, but based on the security that it may offer to them. And both Cloud BC and NASPO Value Point leveraged industry and international standards whenever possible by using the questionnaire, the CCM and CAIQ questionnaires from Cloud Security Alliance, by reviewing the NIST characteristics and definitions, and reviewing the terms and conditions that the Center for Digital Government for Best Practices have put out.
Hi, it's Sophia here, and I've going to come in and just reiterate some of Chris's points to do with the common approach, and then the resulting outcome being one of the outcomes being that the participating entities and eligible customers have specific responsibilities when they use the contract frameworks that were set up as part of the solicitations. So again, the customers must ensure that its own organizational policies and guidelines are followed, and that when reviewing the vendor's response to the solicitation, including the CSA documents, they are responsible to confirm and ensure the vendor meets its business requirements. The participating entities and eligible customers must ensure that they comply with their own organizational security and privacy requirements, and as well, they must ensure that they're adhering to the agreement terms and conditions, unless, of course, they've been specifically modified. So in conclusion, Chris and I just wanted to say again how much this collaboration between the two organizations has yielded benefits, and we see this continuing as the participating entities and eligible customers begin to use the contracts. We see that there will be knowledge sharing that we can do across the jurisdictions that will be valuable. Thank you very much, and back to you, Dugan.
Thanks, Sophia and Chris. Great overview of these two really innovative cooperative procurements for cloud services. Of course, anybody buying cloud services has got to be concerned about protecting the data and making sure that the security and the data controls are appropriate for the applications that they're running. Our next two speakers are going to talk to us a little bit about that. It's really my pleasure to introduce two of the most distinguished and highly respected public sector CIOs. Elaine Starkey is the Chief Information Security Officer with the state of Delaware. She joined Delaware in 1996 as the CIO for the Delaware Department of Public Safety. And as Delaware restructured its IT organization, she was a founding member of Delaware's newly created Department of Technology and Information. She served as the Chief Technology Officer in Delaware until 2005, and she became the Chief Security Officer for Delaware. In her role as the Chief Security Officer, she's responsible for Delaware's enterprise-wide cybersecurity, disaster recovery, and the COOP programs. Elaine chairs the Delaware Information Security Officers team and is a member of Governor Markell's Homeland Security Council. Before joining the public sector, Elaine worked at Xerox and the Webster Research Center on software development, and she managed the corporate computer system for Purdue Farms after leaving Xerox. Elaine's a certified information security professional. She's Computer Week's Federal 100 winner. She's been honored as one of the 10 most influential people in government information security and has received a Distinguished Alumni Award from James Madison University. And she's testified on cybersecurity issues in front of the U.S. Senate. Elaine holds a Master's of Science in Computer Science from Rochester Institute of Technology with concentrations in software engineering and data communications. Joining Elaine is Gary Perkins, the Chief Information Security Officer for the province of British Columbia. As the Executive Director of Information Security, he's responsible for providing cybersecurity services in support of the province. Gary's over 19 years of experience in information technology, risk management, and cybersecurity. Before joining the BC government, he worked in the private sector as the Chief of Staff for security at TELUS, and earlier in his career led teams responsible for incident response, operations delivery, and architecture for both corporate and managed security service customers. A certified information security professional since 2004, Gary also holds an MBA from Simon Fraser University in technology management. So, Gary and Elaine, tell us, what can we be doing or should we be doing to assessing our security and control needs for our applications?
Thank you, Dugan. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm so excited to be part of this webinar and join Gary to offer our perspective from the CISO seat I want to talk a little bit about, from a state government perspective, what we're doing. I think all of my peers, my presenters, the presenters on the call today, we're all responsible for that CIA triad, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's what this is all about. That's the end game. And there's lots of different ways to accomplish it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Delaware in terms of trying to protect the data as it leaves the edge of our network, whether if it's an off-site hosting type of arrangement or a pure cloud type of engagement. We are, as more and more of public sector entities are adopting cloud services, many jurisdictions, including Delaware, has adopted what we call a cloud-first policy. And I feel like I need to define that because it can be a little misleading. It sounds like everything goes to the cloud, right? But that's not the case at all. It means that for all new projects, the cloud is always considered. And there are times when it is decided that it is not appropriate to send the data to the cloud, depending on the classification and a number of other criteria. But when the decision is made to move to the cloud, I think we could probably all agree, or at least consider the following things. First of all, it's a new approach, and it requires a different way of assessing risks and managing those risks and controlling those risks. It also requires contractual clauses, and in my opinion, it requires assertive negotiation so that you mitigate those risks and truly get to a place where you can maximize the benefits of cloud computing. So here in Delaware, I'll talk a little bit as we go along about the process we use. We have a very fairly rigorous vetting process for all engagements that go to the cloud. I personally get involved in many of them. My team has vetted, close to 300 engagements over the last 3 years. They're SaaS, all kinds, SaaS solutions, PaaS, IaaS as well. Doesn't really matter. If the data is going to leave the edge of our network, we get involved to make sure that our goal is that it gets protected. That data gets protected in the same way that it would if it was an on-premise sitting in a state data center. So the guiding principles, that we're using, we want to make sure security is at the table at the beginning, not when they're getting ready to go live, but at the beginning of the conversations. That planning we have found to be a critical success factor. It's important to just jump in that driver's seat. If we don't, then the vendors will. So it's my position to, that we want to be assertive with our service providers. I will tell you that we've seen a dramatic improvement in the quality of the security, the protection, and the controls from our providers over the years. But it truly is kind of a buyer beware approach. It's all about risks. It's all about managing those risks. And in the end, holding the service providers accountable for the protection and the confidentiality and the integrity. So with that, let me pause there and hand the baton over to Gary, who I know has a lot to share as well.
Great, thank you very much, Elaine. So with cloud, as with anything else, we want to understand changes to our risk posture and ensure that we maintain a defensible position at all times. This is true in both public and private sector. And one of the things that we did well in the province of British Columbia is we did exactly what Elaine was talking about with engaging privacy and security right from the very beginning. One lesson we learned was to also engage our identity management folks for authentication and authorization. We didn't do that well in the initial journeys, but since then we're starting to correct that. But we also worked with a number of other organizations along the way, and one of the ones that we engaged was Gartner, and they provided some very useful advice early on, suggesting that there are some areas of what service providers will describe as standard agreements that you're crazy if you think you're going to change them. and other areas still that you're crazy if you accept them as they are. And those are especially around service level agreements and security requirements. As Elaine says, we've seen a marked increase in the maturity and robustness of the security controls offered in cloud services. I know that at the time I was trying to figure out what it was about cloud that suggested customers should suddenly sacrifice these hard-fought requirements around availability and security, among others. So we both recommend taking a risk-based approach and spending the time up front and ensuring you don't end up with any surprises later. So moving along, I often say that data classification is a key enabler to the adoption of cloud, and really you can't responsibly adopt cloud without it. You want to understand what that sensitive data is in addition to where it is and who has it. So I differentiate between shadow cloud and conscious or responsible adoption of cloud, right? So over the last 3 years in the province of BC, we've considered a number of different approaches to public sector adoption of cloud. And some attempts were early on were based on availability needs and some on production versus test data. But ultimately where we've converged and arrived on is the same place as many others, including the federal government in Canada, which is ultimately comes down to that CIA triad and which data requires confidentiality versus the more public, where you're still concerned about the availability and integrity, but possibly not confidentiality. So it comes down to classification. There are some public workloads that may be very well suited for the lowest cost cloud provider that can ensure availability and integrity. And then there's still other workloads that may be more sensitive, require confidentiality, and may not even be suited for a cloud depending on the needs of your organization. So in the province of BC, we engaged the cloud vendors early on in the process and heard very clearly from them when looking to build requirements for cloud security, we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. And of course, we promptly went out and did exactly that, but eventually converged on a model that met our needs. And some of the other things that were out there at the time that weren't the Cloud Security Alliance were just deemed too onerous and really presented a barrier for entry for some of the smaller providers that we don't want to exclude. However, I established early on 3 principles, and maybe they'll help you out. Maybe they're not well suited for you, but they read like this, and then I'll get Elaine's thoughts. Is that my number 1 requirement is that providers are compliant with a established cloud security standard that's acceptable to government. So that may be the Cloud Security Alliance. Second is that the provider can demonstrate annual compliance with cloud security framework via third-party attestation. And the final one, and this is born from experience, that the provider will assist with, to the best of their ability, with security investigations and legal discovery. These are some of the things that have burned me in the past. And in response to these requirements, often providers are serving up PCI, SOX, and SSA 16, which are all fantastic, but they don't have cloud-specific controls. Has that been your experience, Elaine? What?
Yes, it has. And Gary, as you were speaking, I was reminded of like the place where I was just a few years ago when cloud became more mainstream. Security offices always get blamed for being the department of no. And, I actually, there I was in the no camp, that thinking, no way am I going to send, our sensitive personal data out to a data center in who knows where with who knows what kind of protection. And, I kind of reminisce about those days and think how far we've come because, thankfully, because of a lot of the things that you just mentioned and those best practices and that managing the risk, it's because of that I've been able to move to that middle ground where I'm still proceed with caution and I'm still very concerned about this space, but it's not a no, it's what I call it's a yes but answer, right? We're going to get to yes, but there's a but after that, and in our case, it's the detailed terms and conditions that go along with every cloud engagement. So we really just set the parameters very explicitly with our providers, and so we come out of that negotiation being crystal clear on who's responsible for what and what the consequences are for not holding up their end of the bargain. Yeah, so let me just talk a little bit about the data classification, because if there's nothing else that our audience takes away from this webinar, I just can't stress enough the importance of the data classification. We consider it the first step in determining what security controls should be considered, and it's such an important step that we make extra efforts to really stop and do a pause and make sure that we get that right, because it drives all of the rest of our process here. The downside, you have to resist the temptation to overclassify. I think it's tempting to just say, oh, well, everything's confidential or everything's secret or top secret or whatever. And that way, you reduce the chances of making a mistake when you do it that way, but you also end up paying much more and investing much more of your time, your staff time, your provider's time, if indeed that data gets overclassified. It's been my experience that it's extremely expensive. So, there's lots of ways to go. Understanding the breach notification laws is also an important part of that whole process. Also the sensitivity of the data. One of the first questions I always ask: what are the top 5 most sensitive data elements that's going to be part of this engagement, or that's going to move to the cloud? And then think about that, and think about the consequences of the loss or exposure of that. And, there's all kinds of tiers out there. We're not here to necessarily endorse one or the other. You can just use something as basic as low, medium, and high in terms of your classification. That's something quick and easy to get started with. And there's some frameworks as part of the appendices of our presentation. We do have some example frameworks that may be helpful to you as you move forward. So, Gary, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's all great advice. Again, data classification is that first step to responsible adoption of cloud. Those of you who are familiar will know that the province of British Columbia is not unique from a security perspective, but we certainly are from a privacy perspective. So, data residency and sovereignty, they may be a preference for other organizations or other states or provinces, but in the province of BC, it's a legislated requirement for personal information. So we carefully examine the harm that can come if personal information is subject to unauthorized disclosure, and we find that even encryption is not enough to protect citizens from that exposure. So this is a key area where we examine very closely when onboarding cloud providers, and we want to ensure that we know where the data will be held and who's going to be accessing it. And again, classification will be just key to helping us to do that effectively. So as we said earlier, each of the areas covered on the slide here are those where preparation, planning, and organization will pay off. You spend some effort up front, it's going to pay off dividends and not leave you with surprises later. So you want to engage your legal teams, whether it's also performance management, among others, early on to ensure that each of your needs is going to be met, in addition to those security and privacy needs. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, just because it's cloud doesn't mean you have to give up each of your needs. Also look at the penalties and whether they're going to be sufficient. So for example, crediting you with a free month of service may not be sufficient to compensate you for a loss such as a breach, right? And you talked, Elaine, about some of the breach reporting requirements earlier. What are your thoughts on this slide, Elaine?
Yeah, definitely. When you are migrating legacy workload, legacy systems, or whatever, it's those baseline measurements that are certainly really important. Oftentimes the new applications can be designed in a way to minimize impact of adverse considerations or whatever, and also give customers more flexibility too.
Great. So moving on to our last slide, just in a bit of a summary, we want to make sure you understand what's your responsibility as the client or customer versus that of the service provider. And the key one that jumps out to me is the data is often your responsibility, and ensuring that it is protected sufficiently. So for that, you really have to go back to those key tenets or principles that guide your decision to adopt cloud in the first place. And leveraging industry standards as well as that annual certification, we find that it can save you from reinventing the wheel from a requirements perspective, but also save you from some of those surprises down the way. And if you do have unique requirements, as we do in the province of BC, you want to make sure that they're covered to your satisfaction. This is common sense, and the salesmanship and marketing of a cloud provider isn't a substitute for maintaining your own requirements. Over to you, Dugan.
Thank you. That was great, Elaine. Gary, terrific. So now we're going to bring up J.R. Santos. J.R. is with us from Cloud Security Alliance, and J.R. is going to go over using the CSA tools for doing due diligence and taking a look at just what levels of assurances, third-party certifications, standards that cloud applications meet. J.R.
Great. Thanks, Dugan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm J.R. Santos. I'm the Executive Vice President of Research for the Cloud Security Alliance, responsible for a lot of the topics discussed today, or at least the tools that were discussed today related to Cloud Security Alliance. A little bit about CSA. We're a global not-for-profit organization that is member-driven and chartered with promoting the use of best practices for providing security assurance with cloud computing. What we're known for is developing research and educational programs that are made available for free for the industry to use. In addition, we've created the first cloud provider certification within our CSA STAR program, which I'll touch on later in the webinar. And with the workforce in mind, we've created the first ever cloud user certification called the Certificate of Cloud Security Knowledge, otherwise known as the CCSK. You know, our mantra in our organization is really to solve tomorrow's problems today, and the research and educational programs that we as a community create helps with that and contributes to building a trusted cloud ecosystem. So a few facts about CSA, for those of you who don't know about us. We were founded in 2009. Our headquarters are in the Seattle area, Bellingham, and we just opened up a satellite office in Pioneer Square. In addition, we have offices in Singapore and Edinburgh in Scotland. One thing I want to highlight here is our community. As I mentioned, the community is really the backbone of our organization. I actually looked up the numbers yesterday, so we do need to update this slide down the road. But we're up to 76,000 individual members, which I guess we're now identified as one of the largest information security and privacy communities in the world today. In addition, we have over 330 corporate members. And interesting thing here is, you know, people, for those of you who've been following CSA for quite some time now, you know, people have recognized us as, you know, an organization that has a majority of members that are cloud providers. But surprisingly, we've been actually growing on a new classification of members, which is our enterprise members, the end users of cloud. So that's pretty interesting. In addition, we have 80 chapters worldwide, so that number of 75 also grew. This is really our face of our organization within different regions. So there's definitely representation worldwide here. You know, most of our research is crowdsourced and open to the public, but we do have a few that are run out of government grants, that some government grants out of the European Commission, in addition to Singapore and New Zealand, to name a few. But we have over 30 research projects with about 25 different working groups. Outside of the tools that we're going to talk about today, we cover topics like IoT, even kind of forward-thinking issues that our professionals are facing today. Things like quantum computing, things with dealing with containers and securing containers, et cetera. There's a number of different research projects that we're working on currently. As Gary mentioned, we definitely don't want to recreate the wheel, and that's an invention that's fantastic. We want to keep it that way. So, we definitely want to, some of the things that we're doing is the real importance of, these strategic partnerships that we have with different governments and research institutions. We agree with what Gary mentioned, and we partner up with other research institutions, professional associations, certification bodies, and even standards development organizations. So let's talk about the different tools that we have listed here. Having a little delay here with my slides. So the first this slide here really highlights some of the tools that we talk about, that we're going to talk about today. These tools that we develop really focus on cloud due diligence. The first one here is the Cloud Controls Matrix. For those of you not familiar with the CCM, this is specifically designed to provide fundamental security principles to guide cloud vendors and to assist prospective cloud customers and assessing the overall security risk of cloud providers. The CCM provides a controls framework that gives a detailed understanding of security concepts, principles that are aligned with our guidance document, in addition to 16 control domains. And this is really the foundation of the control matrix. So the foundation really rests on its customized relationship with other industry-accepted security standards, regulations, and control frameworks. So you'll see, I'll mention some of the mappings that we map to, but things like ISO 27001, ISACA COBIT, PCI, and NERC-CIP, just to name a few. In addition, we have the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire. It's otherwise known as CAIC, that was referenced to earlier in the call. This is essentially, in short, an assessments tool based on the CCM, and this enables you to conduct cloud computing assessments. The CSA STAR is a program for security assurance in the cloud, and the STAR program actually encompasses key principles of transparency, rigorous auditing, and harmonization of standards as well. And then I'm going to also touch on some of the future innovations that we're currently working on. We're in the process of developing a SaaS assessments tool called STAR Watch, in addition to adding an additional level to our STAR program, which is STAR Level 3, and I'll touch on that a little bit more, but it's really focused on continuous monitoring. So to highlight the controls matrix, this slide really covers at a high level, the two things: controls and mappings. And really, the CCM is the first ever baseline control framework that was designed for cloud supply chain management. And a couple of things that I want to highlight here is the delineation of control ownership. I think this is really important because it really highlights the supplier relationship. So if you look at the control, who's technically responsible, so we divide it by security provider and tenant/consumer. So the way it's structured, as you go through the different columns, you'll be able to identify, again, if you're just starting your cloud strategy and you're curious about what you're responsible for and what the provider's responsible for, this is really a starting point for you to go into that. In addition, it goes into the cloud service delivery model applicability, which you'll get a better understanding of whether each control is applicable to SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS. And as I mentioned, we'll kind of go over some of the different the control domains in the next slide, but it will really highlight some of the control areas that we thought were important and that we've included in this. And really, this is when all said and done, this really anchors the security and compliance posture measurement. So it allows you to really measure not only the provider's organization or security posture, but also if you're assessing the provider, it allows you to get a view into how they're conducting their security program as well. And as I mentioned earlier about the mappings, this is really important too because, as we said earlier, we didn't want to really necessarily recreate the wheel. We wanted to show how each of these compliance requirements and standards map back to the cloud controls that we identify within the matrix. So a little bit about the cloud controls matrix domains. I'm not going to go over them in detail here, but essentially we have 133 controls, and here are the 16 domains that we've highlighted here. It covers everything from encryption and key management to things like mobile security and supply chain management and threat and vulnerability management, just to name a few. So definitely take a look at that in more detail, but unfortunately we can't cover all of that, these sections today. So the next thing I wanted to cover was the Cloud Controls Matrix, or excuse me, the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire. And really, this complements the Cloud Controls Matrix. It's a binary questionnaire, and it really provides you, the question. It breaks down the questions per control domain, and I'll show you an example in the next slide. But this really is, a good tool for you to utilize as you build your assessment process. I talked to numerous companies, governments, and they've included this as part of their as a starting point for their vendor assessment program. And essentially, on the provider side, it helps them kind of measure their security posture. So as I mentioned earlier, with CCM as a framework, this is tools hand in hand really, provide a snapshot of, again, what the provider's security posture is like. So this next slide, as I mentioned, really is a snapshot into the CCM and Cake integration. I know that we can't go over each document in detail, but the slide gives you a look into how CCM and Cake are integrated. This is actually a snippet from the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire. As you can see, it outlines the CCM control specifications. In this case, it's BCR 07, which is a business continuity management and operational resilience control domain. And in that, it breaks down each of the control into 5 different questions. And these questions that are related to the CCM control. The next slide here, what I really want to highlight is the CSA STAR program. The idea of this program was to, essentially just create more transparency in the industry, specifically around the security posture of the providers. The CSA STAR program was actually developed by the Open Certification Framework Working Group within CSA, and that was a public working group that was a part of that research portfolio. There's 3 different levels, and I'll go in those levels in more detail in the next slide. But we've actually created some partnerships with some of the leading ISO certification bodies and different audit firms to help us conduct a number of the different, level 2 of the program. In addition, level 1, we provided a registry that is adopted worldwide by a number of different providers and enterprises. And as I mentioned, we really use this as a way to create more transparency within the cloud ecosystem. So here is a slide that covers the different levels. Level 1 is mentioned the self-assessment. This is a public registry of all the different cloud providers. I believe we have about 175 providers that are listed in the registry today, and a lot of them had completed self-assessment questionnaires, and this is a tool that you could utilize to, take a look at the existing security posture of providers that you're considering. Again, this is a self-assessment, so it's really a high-level answer to the high-level response to the Consensus Assessment Initiative questionnaire. And they submit that, and it's something that's visible to the public and is available. You don't need to have any sort of login or registry there. You can, as a general public, can access this and download all the different entries that are there. And then we started into level 2, which is our third-party assessment. Level 2, there's 2 portions of it. STAR certification, we've actually integrated this into ISO 27001 in 2013. So it's ISO 27001 cert that's scoped to cloud. We worked with BSI as our partner to, create the certification scheme for this. In addition, we partnered with the AICPA to create a SOC 2 that was scoped to cloud as well. And that was used, or CCM was leveraged to also contribute to that attestation. And this attestation is provided, by CPAs and the different auditing firms that are a part of that as well. Last but not least, the level 3, which is not listed here. I'm actually going to cover that here in the next slide. It's a part of some of our future innovations, and essentially level 3 is what we're calling STAR Continuous, and this is essentially based off of continuous auditing and assessments of relevant security properties. So the idea here is to have a continuous instance of the company's security posture. And if you're looking at, for example, I can kind of compare it to visiting the dentist. If you're visiting the dentist annually, it's your essentially your CSA STAR certification. If you're conducting, an ISO 27001 audit annually, it's that instance. In this scenario here with STAR Continuous, we're looking at ways that we can do, a constant check into or give you visibility into the daily security posture of a provider. And, this is currently under development. Our goal originally was to have this out by 2015. Obviously, that's passed, but, we're making some progress in this area, and we're hoping at 2017 that we could get this launched. And then last but not least,
I'm going to have to call you to wrap up right now because we're just about out of time, and we do have a few questions we want to get to. So if you could wrap up.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, definitely. Last but not least, I just wanted to cover the SAS tool, and this is actually going to be released. The beta is going to be released in Q4 of 2016, and that'll be something that I think will highlight or will be a useful tool for everyone that is currently using CCM and Cake. It'll be a way to be able to essentially do things like comparison tools, et cetera. So this is something that we'll be releasing a beta here in Q4 2016.
Thank you so much, JR. Let's go now to quickly to, I think we've got one chance for an audience question here, and we have one that I'm going to ask you this one, Sophia. CSA talks about the need of having a PLA, privacy level agreement, established between the customer and the cloud service provider. Is this something about that Cloud BC or NASPO Value Point have considered?
Hi, yes. We did look at the privacy level agreement on CSA, but it was quite focused on EU privacy laws. And because BC has very specific privacy legislation, there are standard provincial terms and conditions that we had to incorporate into the framework agreement. So in essence, we didn't incorporate the PLA, but we did ensure that privacy was adequately addressed in the contract. So.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. I'm afraid we're about out of time, so if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to contact Sophia, Tham, or myself at this email address, and we're happy to respond to you. We do have a few questions we didn't get to talk about verbally, but we'll respond to those in writing. And with that, I want to thank our speakers. Great job today, and also thank the audience. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. That is it for today. Thank you.